Good morning. Happy Friday. We are on chapter 16 of The Borrowers. I hope that you enjoy hearing this chapter. I feel like we are almost done, only a few more to go, and it's really good, leaving off with how the boy showed himself through their ceiling, and actually turned out to be sort of a friend to them in offering them things he had upstairs. So let's keep reading, and get comfortable and listen up so I can read chapter 16. Then began a curious phase in their lives, borrowing beyond all dreams of borrowing, a golden age. Every night the floor was open and treasures would appear. A real carpet for the sitting room, a tiny coal scuttle, a stiff little sofa with pretty cushions, a double bed with a round bolster pillow, a single ditto with a striped mattress, framed pictures instead of stamps, a kitchen stove which didn't work but looked lovely in the kitchen, where there were oval tables and square tables and a little desk with one drawer. There were two maple wardrobe closets, one with a glass mirror and a bureau or dresser with curved legs. Homily grew not accustomed to the roof coming off, but even went so far as to suggest to Pod that he put the board on hinges. It's just the hammering I don't care for, she explained. It brings down the dirt. When the boy brought them a grand piano, Homily begged Pod to build a drawing room next to the sitting room, she said, and we could move the storeroom farther down. Then we could drag those chairs that he always talks about. Pod, however, was a little tired of furniture moving. He was looking forward to the quiet evenings when he could doze at last beside the fire in his new red velvet chair. No sooner had he put a chest of drawers in one place when Homily came coming in and out of the door to get that effect, made him try it somewhere else. And every evening at about his usual bedtime, the roof would fly up and more stuff would arrive. But Homily was tireless. Bright-eyed and pink-cheeked after a long day's pushing and pulling, she still would leave nothing until morning. Let's just try it, she would beg, lifting up one leg of a large doll sideboard so that Pod would have to lift the other. It won't take but a minute. But as Pod well knew, in actual fact, it would take several hours. And it would be all this disheveling and aching, and then finally he would drop into bed. Even then, Homily would sometimes hop out to have one last look. In the meantime, in payment for these riches, Arrietty would read to the boy every afternoon in the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He would lie on his back, and she would stand beside his shoulder and tell him to turn the page. They were happy days to look back on afterward, with the blue sky beyond the cherries and the grasses softly stirring, and the boy's great ear listening beside her. She grew to know that ear quite well, with its curves and shadows and sunlit pink and gold. Sometimes, as she grew bolder, she would lean against his shoulder. He was very still while she read to him, and always grateful. What worlds they would explore together, strange worlds to Arrietty. She learned a lot, and some of the things she learned was hard to accept. She was made to realize once and for all that this earth on which they lived, turning into space, did not revolve, as she had believed, for the sake of the little people. Not for big people either, she reminded the boy when she saw his secret smile. In the cool of the evening, Pod would come for her, a rather weary Pod, disheveled and dusty, to take her back for tea. And at the home there would be an excited Homily and fresh delights to discover. Shut your eyes, Homily would cry. Now open them, and Arrietty, in a dream of joy, would see her home transformed. Here's the picture. As you can see, looks like she's got Pod busy working and lifting everything, and then she's standing there, and look at all that stuff. Right? Okay. Where am I? All kinds of surprises they were. Even one day, lace curtains at the grating looped up with pink string. Their only sadness was that there was no one there to see. No visitors, no casual droppers in, no admiring cries and envious glances. What would Homily have not given for an overmantel to come see. Even a rain barrel would have been better than no one at all. You write to your Uncle Henry, Homily suggested, and tell him. A nice long letter, mind, and don't leave anything out. Arrietty began the letter on the back of one of the discarded pieces of blotting paper, but it became, as she wrote, in just a dull list, far too long, like a sale catalog or the inventory of a house to let. She would have to keep jumping up to count spoons or to look up words in the dictionary, and after a while she laid it aside, and there was much else to do. So many new books to read, and so much now that she could talk of with the boy. He's been ill, she told her mother and father. He's been here for the quiet and the country air, but soon he'll have to go back to India. Did you know, she asked the amazed Homily, that the Arctic night lasts 6 months, and that the distance between the two poles is less than that between the two extremities of a diameter drawn through the equator? That's a lot. It's a mouthful, right? It sounds like she's learning a lot. Why do you think that is? Why is she learning all this information? Yes, they were happy days, and all would have been well, as Pod said afterwards, if they had stuck to borrowing from the doll's house. No one in the human household seemed to remember it was there, and consequently nothing was missed. The drawing room, however, could not help but be a temptation. It was so seldom used nowadays that there were so many knick-knack tables which had been out of Pod's reach, and the boy, of course, could turn the key in the glass doors of that cabinet. The silver violin brought them first, and then a silver harp. It stood no higher than Pod's shoulder, and Pod's restrung it with horsehair from the sofa in the morning room. A musical conversation, that is what we have, cried the exulting Homily as Arrietty struck a tiny tuneless note on a horsehair string. If only, she went on, clasping her hands, your father would start on the drawing room. She curled her hair nearly every evening nowadays, and since the house was much more or less straight, she would occasionally change for dinner in a satin dress. It hung like a sack, but Homily called it a Grecian look. We could use your painted ceiling, she exclaimed to Arrietty, and there are quite enough of those toy builder bricks to make a floor, a parquet floor, just like the harpsichord. Just like a harpsichord. Even great Aunt Sophie, right away upstairs in the littered grandeur of her bedroom, seemed distantly affected by a spirit of endeavor which seemed to flow in gleeful whirls about that old house. Several times lately, Pod, when he went to her room, had found her out of bed. He went there nowadays not to borrow, not to rest. The room, one might almost say, had become his club, a place where he could go to get away from things. Pod was a little irked by his riches. I wonder what that means, irked. Let's listen, see if you could figure it out. Pod was a little irked by his riches. He had never visualized, not in his wildest dreams, borrowing such as this. Homily felt she should call a halt. Surely now their home was grand enough, these jeweled snuff boxes and diamond encrusted miniatures, these little vanity cases and figurines, all as he knew from the drawing room cabinet, were not really necessary. What was the good of a shepherdess nearly as tall as Arrietty or an outsized candle snuffer? Sitting just inside the fender, where he could warm his hands at the fire, he watched Aunt Sophie hobble slowly through the room on her 2 sticks. She'll be down the stairs soon, I shouldn't wonder, he thought, hardly listening to her old tale about a royal luncheon, aboard a Russian yacht. Then she'll miss these things. It was not Aunt Sophie, however, who missed all those things first. It was Mrs. Driver. Mrs. Driver had never forgotten the trouble over Rosa Pickhatchet. It had not been at that time easy to pinpoint the guilt. Even Crampfurl had felt under suspicion. From now on, Mrs. Driver said, I'll manage on my own. No more strange maids in this house, not if I say so myself. A drop of this here, a pair of old stockings there, a handkerchief of this, an odd vest, an occasional pair of gloves, Mrs. Driver felt were different. These were within her rights. but trinkets out of the dining room cabinet that told herself grimly, staring at the depleted empty shelves, was a total different story altogether. She felt tricked, standing there on that fateful day, in the spring sunshine, feather duster in hand, little black eyes had become slits of anger. It was, she calculated, as though someone suspecting her dishonesty were trying to catch her out. But who could it be? Cramfro, that boy, the man who comes to wind the clocks? These things had disappeared gradually, one by one. It was someone of that she felt sure who knew the house, and someone who wished her ill. Could it, she wondered, suddenly be the old lady herself? The old girl had been out of bed lately, walking around her room. Might she not have come downstairs in the night, poking about with her stick, snooping and spying? Mrs. Driver remembered suddenly that there were things that were left on the table that were missing. Ah, thought Mrs. Driver, was not this just the sort of thing that she might do, the sort of thing that would cackle over back upstairs again among her pillows, watching and waiting for Mrs. Driver to report her losses? Everything all right downstairs, Mrs. Driver? That's what she'd say. And she would look at Mrs. Driver sideways out of those wicked old eyes of hers. I wouldn't put it past her, Mrs. Driver said, gripping her feather duster as though it were a club. And a nice Merry Andrew she'd look if I caught her at it, creeping about the downstairs rooms in the middle of the night. All right, my lady, muttered Mrs. Driver grimly. Pry and potter all you want. Two can play at that game. I hope you enjoyed chapter 16. It gives me a lot to think about for Monday when we meet and talk and discuss. So many different things that I want you to keep in your mind as you had listened to that, and remember for Monday. Pretty cool. All right. I don't want to give too much. I don't want to tell you my thinking, but some things have changed, haven't they? So be prepared to talk about it. Have a great weekend.